everybody. Today I just wanted to share a little simple demonstration that I think helps to highlight why when you're hearing people talk about accessibility, a lot of times you will hear a lot of emphasis on making sure that you're using proper semantic HTML. And this means like not using divs for everything on your page and then styling it to look like a header or a paragraph or a button, but instead actually using header elements, a button element, or a link element to create the content on your page, and additionally using things like header, footer, main, and complementary to designate like different sections of the page. One of the really big sort of ways that this benefits anyone, regardless of ability, is let's say you are asked to work on a web page and you get into it, and here on the left side of my Visual Studio Code, you'll see there's a page where I have the basic HTML kind of layout, except then when I get into the body here, you'll notice that it's just divs. And I've been asked to edit a particular navigation set of navigation links. Well, it might be hard for me to identify a particular section of navigation just looking at this, because I've just got all these different divs. And so it can become very difficult to figure out, okay, well, what am I trying to like narrow down onto and like pick out as what I want to edit. Versus if you look over here on the right hand side, you'll notice I have the header section, and within that there's this nav section. So like here I can just, to make it easier on myself, since my navigation sections are within nav elements, I can easily just search within here for the nav elements, and I can find both of my sections that are labeled as nav pretty quickly. And that's going to make it a lot easier. Similarly, if I am needing to edit all of my H1 elements, since I'm using the H1 element here to designate my H1, which ideally there should only be one H1 on a page. Because of that, it's really easy for me to quickly identify that H1, see where it's located. If I need to look for my H2s, similarly, I have my H2 just right there, easy for me to find. If I'm needing to look for a button, I don't have an example of that on here, but I would just similarly, I would look for a button element. Or if something was within the footer, well, right here's my footer section, so I can really quickly like narrow down and say, okay, right here. And even with a lot of IDEs, you get the option to collapse sections. Well, if you have things divided up, I can easily sit here and collapse the sections that I don't need to work with so that I can just focus on the one that I'm wanting to deal with. And I couldn't do that as easily if I had everything just in divs, because I'd have to figure out, okay, well, I could still, maybe if I've got like an ID like I do here, I might be able to find it that way, but it's just going to be a little bit more work, a little bit more difficult. It's that idea of being self-documenting code kind of playing a role here, because if you're using proper semantic HTML, it's kind of like your code documenting itself. You can easily identify what different things are intended to be used for. The other spot where this comes into play is when it comes to navigation. If I am visually looking at a website, here I have one that's labeled bad, and actually make sure to refresh it so I've got the most up to date. But here I've got a bad example and a good example of a web page. Now visually, aside from one having bad site at the top of it and the other having the words good site at the top of it, visually they look the same. And so visually, if I was navigating this, I could easily sit here and say, okay, well, this text is larger, it's bold, that's a header more than likely. And if I was needing to look for a particular section, I could easily kind of glance through just those quick little sections and probably find, like here for instance, I've got this periodic table of elements section. I could easily narrow in on that and find that. With a screen reader, when you're using that, you're having to use typically the keyboard. You might have some individuals who are low vision who may still make use of the mouse, but a lot of times you'll see people who are using a screen reader are going to primarily use the keyboard. And for them, they would have to tab through and try to move through potentially line by line, trying to just listen for keywords, and they might not be able to as easily tell when they've hit something that is a header. And similarly, when we're getting into semantic HTML and making sure we're coding things properly, if you've probably heard of alt text for images, and if someone was going through this and I didn't have alt text on all these images, they'd potentially just hear the file name. And so if the file name wasn't descriptive, they may have no idea what each one of these images was. And kind of going back to the developer side of things, if you've got all these images and it's just the list of the file names, if you don't have descriptive image names and you don't have alt text, it's also going to cause some difficulty there, being able to identify what an image is and what it's being used for, things like that. So there's kind of a lot of different ways that not using the proper semantic and proper practices with your HTML is going to cause problems. Another way too, kind of going back to the screen reader side of things, one option that a lot of screen reader users will make use of is what's you'll often hear it referred to as rotors, element menus. Basically, in most screen readers, you have this option when you're in the browser to bring up lists of particular kinds of elements, be they form controls, links, headers, things of that nature. And that allows the screen reader user to or even just in general a keyboard user, because you can sometimes bring them up even without using a screen reader, it would give them the option to quickly pull up what are all the headers on the page. And it kind of acts as like a table of contents would in a book. You can pull up that list of headers, you can find the one that you're wanting to navigate to, and quickly get to it. And in a way, it's kind of how visually I could scroll down on this page, quickly pick out all the headers, and just hone in on the one that I want. That's kind of what that option does for a screen reader user. But, and I'm going to actually pull up my screen reader here. I'm going to use NVDA, so it might get a little chatty for a moment. Okay, so now I've got NVDA running, and we're just going to kind of see how, first I'm just going to try to tab into the website and just kind of show you kind of how much of a mess it is. Now the only thing I can tab to is that one link that happens to be there. Granted, part of that's because I don't have a whole lot of links on this page, but the way that you'll notice I'm having to sit here and arrow down to get to other sections. That's essentially what someone using a screen reader would have to do just in general, because nothing's properly labeled. to bring up the elements menu and kind of show you how that gets impacted, I'm going to use my insert F7 key, which is the default option for the rotor controls for NVDA. Oops. Okay, and this is the elements list I mentioned. Now again, as you can see, the links are there. That one link, but that's it. I've got that one periodic table of elements heading on there because it's the only one that's actually using a heading tag. None of the others are, and so that would be the only thing. As far as someone using a screen reader would know, that's all my page has. My page is supposed to be about, because that's the only header that's on there. The other part that's on there is there's one navigation, because there happens to be one navigation set of navigation links that I've given the role of navigation to. But there's technically two navigation sections. I don't have them linked up, but if they were actually both using nav elements, I would see two navigation landmarks on here, and I would be able to go between them. I could set a custom label for one versus the other to let someone know, okay, there's two navigation landmarks, this is the main one, and this is a secondary one, or something to that effect. And similarly, you could use the main element to identify where the main content is of the page. You could use the header to let them know where the header section of the page is, the footer to let them know where the footer section would be, and especially with the footer, you think about when you're navigating a website, a lot of times companies will put the contact information or links to the contact information in their footer on their page. If they haven't used the footer element, someone's going to have to scroll down or tab through each individual link on the page to find where the contact link is. Now, I'm going to switch over to the good example, and just to kind of, for disclaimer purposes, it's not using Optimum HTML, but it's just better in the sense that it shows a little bit better how you would mark things up. Okay, now I am on my better example. I'm going to open up that elements list again. Now again, there's only the one link currently on this page, so you're only going to, when I go under the links section, you just see that one link. But where we're going to see a big difference is when I go under headings and landmarks. So next I'm just going to go over to the headings. Now you'll notice they're not well labeled just because I used kind of generic generated text for the headers, but you'll notice there's a top level header, there's a second level header, and there's a third level header, and they're actually because they're also in the proper order. And that's also very important when you're using your headers, is to make sure you're going 1, 2, 3, and not 1, 3, 5, 2. You want to make sure they are in a logical order and hierarchy. But here again, because there's the different levels of headings and they're all using the proper heading tags, a user would be able to go to this headings and actually see all my headings on the page and quickly move to. So for instance, I'm going to click on the third level heading and I'm going to tell it to move to it. See? And there we go. It went straight down to the bottom of the page. There's not enough past the bottom for it to scroll and have that at the top of the page, but it took my focus, if I was using the screen reader to navigate through the page, my focus would automatically be on that third level heading, and I could then go straight to the text that's below it. Now I'm just also going to show you the landmarks and how those are different now because this page is better laid out than the bad example. Now you'll see here, I've got the banner, which is that top header element. Within that, you can see that there is nested a navigation element within it. Beneath that, I have a main, and then below that, I have the content info, which is the footer section. They may be somewhat labeled different depending on what screen reader in particular you're using, but this is just kind of giving you an idea that here the user would be able to pull up this landmarks section and would be able to quickly go down. So for instance, if they wanted to get down to where they figured the contact info is going to be in the footer, they could easily select that content info section and then move straight down to it. I'm not going to do that here right now just because the page is already scrolled down to the bottom. So just know that if I selected the content info section right now and I told it to move to it, it would automatically put my focus at the top of that footer section. So whatever the first bit of content was within that, that's what it would take me to. And so that's just kind of a brief example of why having semantic HTML is considered just so important within accessibility, because as you can see, it can make a huge difference in how well your users can navigate the content, and then also from the development side, it's going to make it a lot easier for your developers who are needing to navigate that HTML possibly years down the road. It's like self-documenting code essentially at that point. And I thank you for taking the time to listen to what I had to say today. If you're interested in learning anything else about this, I do have a... Oh. Sorry, had to close out NVDA there. But if you're interested in learning more, I do have my page at corgidev.com. You can also, if you go to GitHub and navigate to my profile, which is also corgidev there, I have a accessibility materials repo. It's labeled as A11Y-materials. I actually have copies of some of the presentations I've done, documentation, and more to help if you're wanting to learn more about this. And again, thank you so much.